Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into another fascinating chapter of history. Today, we're stepping back in time to explore a period of massive change, the agricultural and industrial revolutions in Britain.
It's a really interesting era, especially when you see how closely those two revolutions were connected.
Right, it wasn't just one happening after the other. It's more like what? Two gears in a machine, each one driving the other.
Exactly.
So let's start with the basics food, because you can't have an industrial revolution without feeding all those people building the factories, right?
Right.
And England's population was booming back then. We're talking about a jump from like 5.8 million people in 1750 to a whopping 21 million by 1850.
Wow, that's a huge increase.
Yeah, it's incredible. So how on earth did they keep up with feeding that many people?
Well, a lot of it had to do with a rising standard of living, at least for the working class. People were generally healthier, living longer, so they were having more children, and those children were more likely to survive to adulthood. But you're right, feeding all those extra mouths meant some serious innovation in agriculture.
No pressure on the farmers, right? It's not like they could just, order takeout.
Exactly. And that's where we see people like Charles Turnip Townsend entering the scene.
Okay, I have to ask you about the nickname, Turnip Townsend. It's not exactly glamorous, is it? What made this guy so special?
Well, you know a guy's serious about agriculture when his nickname is a root vegetable, right?
Uh-huh, true.
But seriously, Townsend was a pioneer of crop rotation. Before him, the common practice was to leave fields fallow, essentially empty for a whole year so the soil could recover. But Townsend, he figured out that by rotating crops, especially by including plants like clover, which actually puts nitrogen back into the soil, and then crops like turnips that suck nutrients out, you could keep the soil fertile year-round.
Wow, so more food on the same amount of land?
Exactly.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Just changing what they planted made a huge difference.
And Townsend wasn't the only one. You've also got Robert Bakewell, who completely changed livestock breeding. He was all about selective breeding to get bigger, healthier animals, more meat for everyone.
Makes sense. And what about Jethro Tull? Didn't he invent something?
Oh, you mean the seed drill? Yeah. Before that, imagine planting seeds by hand, one by one, over acres of land.
Talk about tedious. There's no way that was very efficient.
Not at all. Tull's seed drill planted seeds in these nice, neat rows, all perfectly spaced, faster, more efficient, and in the end, much higher yields.
So it wasn't just about more food. It was about changing how it was grown.
Absolutely. These innovations, they totally transformed how agriculture worked.
And this all ties into the Industrial Revolution, right? I mean, you need more than just food to make that happen. What else was going on?
It's like you've got all these ingredients now, right? And the Industrial Revolution's about to bake the cake.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
But even with all these ingredients, these agricultural innovations, you still need something to I don't know, light the oven, right? What really kicked off the Industrial Revolution on that side of things?
You need a spark. And in this case, one of those sparks was trade.
Trade. Okay, how so?
Well, Britain was all about this system called mercantilism. Basically, it meant they were really focused on increasing their wealth and power through trade, especially with their colonies.
Okay, that makes sense. They were importing raw materials from places like India and the Caribbean, right?
Yeah.
Turning them into finished goods.
Exactly. They were getting those raw materials for, well, relatively cheap, turning them into things like textiles and manufactured goods, and then selling those to other countries at a much higher price.
I'm kind of like buying low and selling high on an international scale.
You got it. And they were really good at it. Our sources mention that re-exports, so those are the goods that Britain made and then sold to other countries, they increased dramatically during this time.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. But wait, with all this buying and selling and shipping things around, didn't they need a way to actually move all those goods?
Good point. And you're right, even back then, transportation was key.
It's not like they had Amazon Prime delivering everything next day. Haha.
Not quite. This era also saw a revolution in transportation, especially within Britain itself. Remember those turnpike trusts we talked about?
Vaguely. Weren't those like privately funded roads or something?
Yeah. They were companies that would build roads and then charge people tolls to use them. It was a pretty clever way to fund infrastructure back then.
It sounds strange to us now, but I guess it makes sense. And hey, smoother roads probably made traveling a bit more pleasant for anyone who wasn't riding in a fancy carriage too, right?
You can imagine. Bouncing along those old dirt roads must have been quite the experience. But yeah, roads were just one piece of the puzzle. This was also the golden age of canals.
Canals.
Right.
Weren't those like the superhighways of their time?
Exactly. They provided a much cheaper and more efficient way to transport large quantities of goods, particularly bulky stuff like coal, over long distances.
And coal was essential, right? The fuel that power all those factories and industries.
Exactly. Britain was fortunate to have abundant coal deposits, which played a massive role in fueling their industrial growth.
So let me see if I've got this right. We've got a growing workforce thanks to those agricultural improvements, booming trade thanks to mercantilism and smart economic strategies. And now we've got better transportation and a key fuel source, coal, ready to power it all.
You've got it. It's like all the pieces were falling into place for something truly revolutionary.
It really does sound like the perfect setup, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But what about the specific industries?
Yeah.
What were the big winners in this whole industrial revolution game? Okay, so let's step into those factories, shall we? I'm ready to hear about the big players, the industries that really define the Industrial Revolution. Our sources point to iron and textiles as the real game changers.
They were massive,
Yeah.
and both industries underwent incredible transformations during this time.
Let's start with iron. I have to admit, I don't know much about how it's made, but the thought of these huge factories filled with like molten metal and giant machines, it's kind of intimidating.
It's definitely a far cry from a blacksmith's workshop, that's for sure. Before the 18th century, iron production was pretty limited because it relied on charcoal for fuel. But charcoal was getting expensive, and forests were being chopped down faster than they could regrow.
Makes sense. You can't exactly make iron without fuel, right?
Exactly. But then, in 1709, Abraham Darby figured out that you could smelt iron using coke instead.
Coke, like the drink.
Not quite. It's a fuel that's derived from coal. And remember how we talked about Britain having a ton of coal?
Right. It was everywhere.
So Darby's discovery was a big deal. It meant they could produce much larger quantities of high-quality iron. And they weren't limited by dwindling charcoal supplies anymore.
Wow. So this one discovery really changed the game for iron production.
It was a game changer, for sure. And it paved the way for all sorts of things, like stronger bridges, larger buildings, and eventually those miles and miles of railroad tracks.
It's amazing how one innovation can have such a ripple effect on, like, everything else.
Yeah. It's all connected. But the innovation in the iron industry didn't stop there. In the 1780s, Henry Cort developed the puddling furnace and the rolling mill, which made the iron-making process even more efficient.
They're efficient, so they can make even more iron faster.
You got it. To give you an idea of the impact between 1788 and 1805, British pig iron production quadrupled. That's a four-fold increase.
Wow, they weren't messing around. Okay, so we've got iron booming. What about textiles? Our sources mention all these inventors like Hargreaves, Arkwright. It's a lot of names. What were they up to?
They were the textile titans. Each of those guys, Hargreaves, Arkwright, Crompton, Kay, Cartwright, they all invented machines that revolutionized different parts of the textile production process.
So, like, if one person improved spinning, someone else would come along and improve weaving.
Exactly. It was a constant stream of new inventions and improvements, each one building on the last and pushing the boundaries even further.
And at the heart of this textile boom was cotton. Why cotton?
Cotton was like the miracle fiber of the time. It was cheap, it was versatile, and you could spin it into all kinds of fabrics. Lancashire became the center of cotton production in Britain. By 1838, it had a staggering 1,200 cotton mills.
Wow, 1,200. That's incredible. But I have to imagine all this progress, it didn't come without a cost, did it? Our sources also talk about the downsides of the Industrial Revolution.
You're right. For all its progress, the Industrial Revolution had a dark side. Cities were growing at an unprecedented rate, which led to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and really tough living conditions for many people, especially the working class.
Our sources paint a pretty grim picture of life in those factories. Long hours, dangerous conditions, and child labor. It's hard to even imagine children as young as 6 working in those environments.
It's a stark reminder that progress often comes with hidden costs. Charles Dickens actually wrote about this really vividly in his novel Hard Times. He didn't shy away from depicting those harsh realities.
It's easy to get swept up in all the excitement of invention and progress, but it's so important to remember the people who are most affected by these changes, both good and bad.
Absolutely. It's a complex and fascinating period of history, and it's incredible to see how much those changes continue to shape the world we live in today.
That's a really good point. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the agricultural and industrial revolutions.
I agree. It's been a fascinating journey.
We hope you've enjoyed this exploration as much as we have. We've covered a lot of ground, From innovative farming techniques that revolutionized food production to groundbreaking inventions that reshaped entire industries. And we've also shed light on the often overlooked human cost of this progress. If there's one thing to take away from this deep dive, it's that history is never simple. There's always more to uncover, more to learn, and more to think about.
Well said. And who knows what fascinating corners of history we'll explore next time.
Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep those brain cogs turning. Thanks for joining us.